Soft landing or crash landing? Does anyone really know where the property boom is going to end up?
Hello and welcome to the programme. Well, later tonight, the continuing fallout from the Dr Michael Neary scandal. Will the new legislation for regulating doctors, due to become law next week, protect patients and ensure that a similar case could never happen again?
Well, for some very lucky people out there, the price of property no longer matters. For the rest of us, it matters a great deal. And yet, when we go looking for sound advice about our most valuable asset, we get divided opinion. The experts agree the rise in house prices has slowed, if not stopped. But when they offer predictions about the property market, some tell you soft landing and others say crash landing. Certainly the pessimists are finding their voice, for example, on last night's Future Shock programme on RTE, which pointed to signs of an impending property slump. We'll be hearing both sides of this critical debate in a few minutes, but first, here's Una Smith.
With no more growth in the housing market, the doomsaying about a crash is getting louder.
It could start tomorrow, or it could take another 2 or 3 years before that starts, but it's got to happen sometime.
It is something outside happening could puncture it here, and there would be very little you could do to prevent it.
So what are the reasons given for a likely crash? The lack of affordability has meant a drop in first-time buyers, one of the fundamentals underpinning real value in the market. Whilst in 2001, 63% of new homes were bought by first-time buyers, it's now at 33%. Furthermore, only 1/3 of properties are now being sold at auction, as opposed to 90% in the boom years. Others say this could simply be the start of our soft landing, with buyers holding back, hoping for the reform of stamp duty.
I'm also effectively abolishing stamp duty as we know it by simplifying the code here, by introducing 3 bands, 0%, 5% and 9%.
The second predictor of a crash is that rents have not risen with house prices, suggesting that the market is a bubble and not driven by demand. For example, for an interest-only mortgage on a €1 million house, the mortgage is €4,000 a month, but the rent will only be half that. So if investors pull out suddenly, and they make up 40% of our market, a crash is more likely. In contrast, the OECD says a soft landing is the most likely prospect, and the central bank says that house prices are not out of line with market fundamentals. The third predictor of a crash is our economy's over-reliance on construction, which has slowed by 10%. It will accelerate a downturn if jobs go and workers leave.
How long we have the job here and good conditions, we stay here. I tell you, if there start to be problem with the job here from all foreigners, they just going back to countries, that's it.
Others argue that our economy is strong. It rose by over 6% last year and predict that it'll rise by at least 4% per year until the end of the decade, requiring over 50,000 migrant workers per year, all who will need a roof over their head. A final predictor of the crash comes from international experience. In roughly 40 cases, the bigger the boom, the more likely the bust. Given that our boom was so dramatic, with prices increasing by 270% in 10 years, our prices could fall between 40% and 60% in 9 years. The most likely trigger is the devaluing dollar, which is affecting our exports and competitiveness and could lead to multinationals pulling out. Against this, other economists say housing demand is still high for the foreseeable future as the economy grows and the population rises.
That was Una Smith reporting. Well, I have 2 economists in the studio with me with very different views. Professor Morgan Kelly from UCD and Jim Power of Friends First. Morgan Kelly, you're on the pessimistic side of this equation. You've written that the value of the Irish housing market could be halved by an approaching slump. That's not a guess, I'm assuming.
No, what happened was late last year I got tired of listening to the various paid cheerleaders for the property sector saying that we're going to have a soft landing. So what I did was I looked at all the different economies around that have had property booms, and all of them, without exception, have had very big property busts immediately afterwards. You can predict the size of the bust from the boom. It's just like a Roadrunner film. Roadrunner goes into thin air. He doesn't have any soft landing. He falls straight down. Typically, you lose about 70% of what you've gained in the boom in the subsequent bust. For Ireland, that means a fall of somewhere in the region of 50%.
You talk about the cheerleaders, they call you a doomsayer. They say the nature of the property business is that if you say it long enough, and people like you say there will be this bust, it's going to happen.
It's going to happen whether we say it or not. We've had several years now, the property industry has been talking it up, saying, great, buy houses, there's no risk of a fall. You have people now, they're mortgaging their lives away, their parents' life savings are going into these houses. It's been talked up, and now it's running out of steam. It's going to fall, whether we talk about it or not.
Jim Power, if you look at history books, Morgan Kelly says, you'll see there's no such thing as a soft landing. A boom will always end in a bust.
I suppose the first thing I should say is that I'm not a paid cheerleader for any property interest, OK? I have analysed the Irish property market very closely over the last 10 years, and you'd have to say the evolution of prices over that period reflects the fact that there's been a dramatic transformation of this economy. You know, we're talking about a doubling of employment in 10 years from just over 1 million to over 2 million people at the moment. We've had strong inward migration in recent years. That's creating a demand directly or indirectly via the rental market. We've had a once-off step adjustment to interest rates when we joined the single European currency. So there's a whole, and I suppose more fundamentally, the Irish economy in the last decade has been utterly transformed from a seriously underdeveloped economy with a lack of a proper housing stock, with extremely low house prices, to one that is now roughly in line with the international norm. I think
that was then, but this is now. You mentioned the rental market. Look at that as an alarm bell, where rental is not matching the value of the house.
Well, I suppose the first point to make is that our Irish house prices today out of line with the fundamentals of the last decade. I don't believe they are. I think there's a very good reason. I could identify pockets of the markets where there has been a little bit of irrational exuberance, but in general, on average, I think the market is fundamentally sound. In terms of the rental market, you know, the rental market is cyclical. Over the last, up to 12 months ago, rents on a year-on-year basis were actually declining. In the last 12 months, we've seen a significant pickup, and according to the CSO, they're currently growing 8 to 10% year-on-year. So the rental market is coming back again. The question is, what do investors get into the market for? Is it to cover their mortgage? Is it to gain long-term capital appreciation? It differs across the spectrum, but I would find it hard to believe that there are investors out there today who would actually offload their property investments on the basis that they're not covering their mortgage.
And Morgan Kelly, with respect, it's not just cheerleaders who are saying the same thing. As Una Smith pointed out in her report, the OECD, the central bank, are saying this. We have, you know, top growth rates in the EU in this country. It's not the kind of country you'd expect to be heading toward a property crash.
The assumption here is that we're the first country in human history that's ever had a boom. Lots of places have booms, property prices go up, then something happens, they slow down, people's expectations change, property prices collapse.
But the point here is that the fundamentals here are strong. They may not have been in some other places.
Nonsense. That we just need to look at what's happened to
highest
rents.
Growth rate in Europe?
No, just look at what's happened to rent relative to prices. That you have rents have stayed stable since 2000, prices have doubled. We've now got the highest prices in Europe. We've got among the lowest rents.
With the youngest population, rising population.
No, if that were there, they're not enough of these to fill the houses, to drive up the rents. We've got over 250,000 empty units in the economy. We're building about 80,000 a year. This is a classic bubble. It's going to end in tears, no question about it.
I fundamentally disagree. I mean, the fundamentals of Ireland are pretty unique in an international context at the moment. We have 1 million people aged between 25 and 35, which is where people typically buy their first house, okay? So there's strong natural demand there. We also have strong inward migration, which is obviously subject to relative economic performance. They could all leave again in the morning for whatever reason.
And that brings us to the importance of the construction sector. 15% of the economy compared to other places where it's far lower.
It is far lower.
That's not construction, that's houses alone. If you want an example to frighten people, which wasn't mentioned last night, is Arizona. Okay? Arizona had, again, a boom, much bigger than ours, slightly bigger, about half as large population, huge inward migration, gigantic house building. Up until early last summer, they were building about 8,000 units a month, exactly what pretty much what we're building now. Sales started to fall even before interest rates rose. Construction fell from 8,000 at the start of summer down to 3,000 units at the end. You've acres now of what are called the new ghost towns of the West.
Yeah, Ireland has come from a seriously underdeveloped situation in terms of its stock of residential property. We had a much lower stock of property than any other European country. I mean, there is a strong requirement to be pumping a lot of concrete into this economy because of the fact that we've come from such an underdeveloped situation. I mean, if we saw another 2 or 3 years of the sort of insanity in the housing market that we've seen over the last couple of years, I would totally agree with Morgan.
What about the external shock?
The market,
rising interest rates, or a dollar collapse, for example? These things, if they happen, surely that's really good.
You don't even need those.
Mark,
you just need guys being laid off by the building industry.
I could engineer for you a set of circumstances which would see you out of work in the morning. You can engineer a set of circumstances to come up with any result.
Aside from my job security, I'm not going to.
But you know, what I'm saying is, if
here.
interest rates shoot up, if there's an employment shock, if we see a lot of foreign multinationals leaving the country, you know, the list goes on and on. I come up with any number of arguments as to why the thing could burst like that. But the reality is that those things are unlikely to happen. There is a fundamental basis at the moment. I think we're at the early stage in the well, we're 12 months into a significant slowdown in the market. I think that is very desirable.
Okay,
I think it makes the situation more sustainable in the longer term.
Final question to you, Morgan Kelly. People out there are going to be very worried, specifically people at risk. What's your advice to people? Is it to sell up now, get out while you can, and come back in 10 years?
My advice is rent now, don't buy. Rents are low. Rent for a few years, see what's going to happen.
You'd bet the house in it. You'd sell the house now.
No, don't. Sell, that's a different matter. That's up to you if you want to do it.
But where's the rent demand going to be satisfied from? That means
we've got these 210,000 empty units. We've got 80,000 coming on. We are facing major job losses in the building industry. Houses are not selling right now. We are going to see massive job losses
I'm going to have to
now in the autumn.
Leave it there. Morgan Kelly and Jim Power, thanks very much for joining us. Miriam.